1975, Truman Capote, the literary genius who had built a career as the supreme narrator of women's lives, committed spectacular social suicide. He published La Côte Basque, a public bloody autopsy of every secret his wealthy high society swans had ever trusted him with. The retribution was absolute. The world of beautiful, tragic women in gilded cages, the only women he valued, banished him, and he died alone. For the other women, the emerging feminists he famously mocked as coarse and noisy, he had only contempt. He thought their demands for power were a joke, failing to see the storm that was about to make his entire world obsolete. But while Capote was being exiled from his dying world, another woman was methodically building a new one. Her name was Gloria Steinem. She was the one woman Capote couldn't mock, the warrior he couldn't see. Why? Because his weapons, social shame, status, and gossip, were useless against someone who wasn't asking for a seat at his table, but was busy building a new house. Steinem didn't want to be a swan. She wanted power. This is the story of that historic clash, of how Gloria Steinem took Capote's greatest weapon, the stories of women, and turned it from a whisper of tragic gossip into a revolutionary roar that changed the world. The key to Gloria, the very blueprint for her entire revolution, is found in the cages she was born to destroy. Before Gloria Steinem could start a revolution, she had to understand her enemy. And that enemy wasn't a man. It was a system that had created two types of cages for women, both of them ruthlessly effective. First, there was the gilded cage. This was Capote's world, the world of the high society swans. They were women with status but no power, glittering ornaments bound by economic and emotional dependency, their very existence defined by their husbands. Then there was the other cage, a far more common one. Let's call it the invisible cage. This was the world millions of American women inhabited in the mid-20th century, the world of numbing, paralyzing emptiness in the suburbs that Betty Friedan described in The Feminine Mystique. This was a brutal reality. Consider the reality of a woman at the time Gloria Steinem was born and raised. Legally, she could not get a credit card in her own name. She needed her husband or father to co-sign. If she wanted a bank loan to start a business, an almost laughable thought at the time, she needed a man's signature for that too. The newspaper Help Wanted ads were legally segregated. Help Wanted, male, and Help Wanted, female. The male jobs were managers, doctors, lawyers. The female jobs were secretaries, nurses, teachers, at significantly lower pay. A woman could be legally fired for being pregnant. Marital rape was not a concept. The law assumed that by marrying, a woman had given permanent consent to sex on demand. This cage wasn't made of gold. It was made of laws, social expectations, and a terrifying isolation. Whether gilded or invisible, both cages trapped women the same way, through dependency. Neither world realized that a storm was approaching. Neither was prepared for a woman who fit neither mold, a woman who had seen both cages early on and saw them not as protection, but as a death sentence. Gloria Steinem did not come from the gilded cage of Park Avenue, nor did she come from the neat, orderly, invisible cage of the suburbs. She came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere messier, scarier, and ultimately far more revolutionary. She came from her mother's world. To understand Gloria Steinem, you have to forget the icon, forget the aviator glasses, the perfect highlights, and the raised fist. You have to go to Toledo, Ohio, in the early 1940s, to a collapsing house with no indoor plumbing, and look at a woman named Ruth. Ruth Steinem is the key. She is the psychological engine that created Gloria. She was the living, tragic embodiment of what happens to a brilliant woman when the system breaks her. Before Gloria was born, Ruth Steinem was not a victim. She was a star. Ruth was a graduate of the prestigious Smith College. She was a journalist, an editor, a sharp, witty woman ahead of her time. She wrote for the local paper. She was an independent thinker. She had a career. Then she married Leo Steinem. Leo was a character. He was charming, flamboyant, and utterly unreliable. He was a kind of Midwestern Gatsby, an itinerant antiques dealer who was always chasing the next big deal. He didn't believe in a stable life. He didn't believe in staying put. For the early years of their marriage, they lived a strange nomadic life, traveling the country in a trailer, selling antiques. Leo even bought a summer resort in Michigan and ran it as a combination of theater and amusement park. Gloria spent her first summers there, learning to tap dance and wait tables. It was an unstable life, but it was adventurous. And then Ruth broke. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion. The career she loved was gone, replaced by endless travel and Leo's financial instability. She had 2 daughters, and something inside her fractured. She began to suffer from debilitating bouts of depression. She reportedly began to hear voices. She would sit motionless for hours or fall into uncontrollable fits of panic. Today, we might call it postpartum depression or bipolar disorder, or simply a rational reaction to a life that had become unbearable. In the 1940s, they just called her neurotic or crazy. When Gloria was 8, a pivotal event occurred. Her father, Leo, the perennial flyer, finally flew away for good. He left. He and Ruth divorced. And suddenly, 10-year-old Gloria Steinem became the only adult in the room. Gloria's sister was much older and already out of the house. It was just Gloria and her mother, Ruth, in a dilapidated old house in a poor Toledo neighborhood. The house had no central heating. Rats ran in the walls. Gloria's life became a relentless cycle of caregiving. She was not a child. She was a nurse, a psychologist, a housekeeper, and the single person keeping her mother alive. She would get up, go to school. She would come home to a terrifying silence, never knowing what she would find. Would she find her mother dressed, having a good day? Or would she find her huddled in bed, refusing to eat, lost in delusions? Gloria learned to soothe her. She learned to lie to bill collectors. She learned to stretch the meager money to buy food. She staged a fake wedding for the rats in the house to turn their horror into a game, just to make her mother smile. Gloria grew up witnessing what this isolation and dependency does to a brilliant woman, and she vowed never to repeat her mother's fate. Ruth wasn't a suburban housewife. She wasn't a social swan. She was something more tragic, a wasted talent, a mind imprisoned in a psyche and a society that had betrayed her. She was completely, utterly dependent on a child for her survival. That experience forged Gloria. It burned a core truth into her, a primal fear that shaped every decision she would ever make. Dependency in all its forms was a slow death. Marriage, as she saw it through the lens of her mother, was not a partnership. It was an erasure. It was where smart, capable women went to die. Gloria's entire life would be a rebellion against that fate. She wasn't just running from Toledo, she was running from the ghost of Ruth. But she also carried a profound guilt, the guilt of the weary caregiver, the guilt of wanting a life of her own. When Gloria was 17, she did something that felt both like a liberation and a brutal betrayal. She escaped. She did what her mother had done decades before. She got into Smith College. She left her mother. She left Ruth in the care of her older sister, and she got on a train to Massachusetts carrying one suitcase and an ironclad resolve. I will never, ever be like my mother. I will never be dependent on anyone. I will never get married. She arrived at Smith College in the 1950s, one of the last bastions of WASP privilege. She immediately felt like an outsider. She wasn't from money. She didn't have the right clothes. She carried the scars of Toledo, of poverty, and her mother's illness. And the world of the 1950s, the world of Dwight D. Eisenhower and tea parties, immediately tried to force her into a cage. She was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, an easy, natural beauty that made her stand out. And the system knew what to do with pretty girls, marry them off. The entire culture of Smith and every other women's college at the time was that of a finishing school. You went not to get a career, but to get a Mrs. degree. You studied art and literature and history so you could be an interesting dinner party companion for a future lawyer or doctor from Yale or Harvard. Her classmates would organize raids on the men's colleges on weekends. They would flash their engagement rings. The goal was to graduate with a husband pending Gloria played the game. Or at least she tried. She dated. She got engaged. Yes, Gloria Steinem was once engaged to be married. He was a good man from a good family, a safe choice. And as she looked at the ring on her finger, she didn't feel joy. She felt terror. She felt the cage door swinging shut. She saw the ghost of her mother. The story goes that she had an epiphany while eating a Thanksgiving turkey dinner. She looked down at the ring, then at her plate, and realized she couldn't tell the difference between herself and the turkey. She broke off the wedding. It was her first real act of rebellion. It was a rejection of the invisible cage that everyone around her was so happily walking into. She graduated in 1956, and like every other smart graduate, she was faced with a choice. She could take a female job, or she could get married. Gloria chose a third option, an option no one saw coming. She refused a marriage, she refused a job, and instead of moving to New York or the suburbs, she did something utterly radical. She moved to India. This wasn't a vacation. She had received the Chester Bowles Memorial Fellowship, a postgraduate research program. She was 22 years old. She knew no one. She had no money, and she went to the other side of the world. This is one of the most overlooked yet most formative chapters of her life, because it was in India that Gloria Steinem learned to be a revolutionary. She didn't stay in fancy hotels or expatriate compounds. She did what few Westerners did. She immersed. She wore a sari. She slept on the dirt floors of village huts. She rode in third-class train cars, jammed in with hundreds of people. And most importantly, she listened. She traveled from village to village with followers of Gandhi, community organizers who were trying to heal the country after the violent partition from Pakistan. And this is where she learned her theory of change. In America, she had learned that change came from the top down, from politicians, from powerful men. In India, she learned the opposite. She learned from the Gandhians that real power was at the grassroots. It didn't come from giving orders. It came from sitting in a circle. She learned the art of consciousness raising 10 years before it had a name. She would sit with village women, women with no literacy and no power, and she would just listen to them talk about their lives. She would ask, and then what happened? She realized that as people began to share their supposedly personal stories of money, of violence, of injustice, they realized they weren't alone. They realized their problem wasn't a personal failing. It was a systemic problem. And that was the moment shame turned into anger, and anger turned into action. She also saw something else. She saw the brutal realities of India's caste system, and she made the intellectual leap that few in America were making. She looked at the treatment of women in America, the treatment of Black Americans, and the treatment of the Dalit caste in India. And she realized it was all the same thing. It was a caste system, a system that divides human beings based on the accidents of birth, race, or gender, and then pretends it's the natural order of things. Her 2 years in India transformed her. It took the scared, guilty girl from Toledo and replaced her with a global thinker. It gave her a framework. It gave her a theory of change. When she returned to the United States in 1958, she was already a revolutionary. She just didn't have a revolution to join yet. She moved to New York City, the center of the universe, and she decided she was going to change the world the only way she knew how. She was going to be a journalist. She wanted to write the serious stories. She wanted to write about politics, about social issues, about what she had seen in India. But the New York journalism world of the 1960s looked at her and saw only one thing. They didn't see a Smith intellectual. They didn't see a global thinker. They saw a pretty girl. The editors, all of them men, saw only one thing. No matter her credentials, they reduced her to a face, not a mind. They patted her on the head. "Great ideas, kid," they'd say, "but why don't you write about something you know? Like fashion?" The system tried to force her into a cage all over again. This time, it was the pink ghetto of women's journalism. They assigned her the girl stories. Write about food, write about makeup, write about the new crazy hosiery. One of her first articles was about how to sleep on the road with your hair in curlers. Another was about the new kicky stockings. It was humiliating. Here she was, a Smith graduate who had debated political philosophy in India, and she was writing about hosiery. She was trapped. She needed money. She had to pay rent. So she took the jobs. She wrote the fluffy, meaningless articles, and she loathed every minute of it. She was trying to play by the rules of the male-dominated journalism world, but she despised it. And she realized these men would never give her a chance. They would never see past her face and her legs. And then she had an idea born of pure, unadulterated frustration, an idea that was pure Gloria. If the system was only going to see her as a body, an object, a girl, then fine. She would use that body as a weapon. She would use their expectations against them. She would play the dumb, pretty girl they wanted her to be, and she would use it to infiltrate the enemy and expose him from the inside, the target, the new flashy, male-worshipping fortress of sexual consumerism, the symbol of fake sexual liberation, Hugh Hefner's Playboy Club. In 1963, this idea was a radical, almost suicidal journalistic act. No serious journalist, certainly no serious woman, would debase herself by becoming a Playboy bunny. But Gloria wasn't a serious journalist. She was an angry journalist. She sold the idea to an editor at Show magazine. She adopted a fake name, Marie Oakes. She bleached her hair. She squeezed herself into the famous bunny uniform, an outfit she described as impossibly tight, with a dry cleaning bag's worth of foam padding stuffed in her bra and a cotton tail stuck in a not-so-comfortable place. She got the job, and for 2 weeks she lived the life. The article she wrote, A Bunny's Tale, was a bombshell. It wasn't a witty satire. It was a cold, detailed expose of systemic exploitation. She documented everything. The humiliation. Bunnies were not allowed to date. They were subject to constant weigh-ins. They had to follow a bizarrely thick rulebook. The financial deception. The promises of huge tips were a myth. After deductions for their costumes, their bunny school classes, and fines for minor infractions, most of the girls were making less than minimum wage. The physical exhaustion, the hours of standing in agonizing high heels, carrying heavy trays, and constantly smiling while enduring crude comments and prying hands. But the most damning part was the interview with the bunny mother, who explained to an undercover Gloria, that the entire operation wasn't about selling drinks, it was about selling status to men. "It's the guys who can't get a good-looking girl," she said, "so they come here to buy one." The article was a massive hit. It exposed the core hypocrisy of the Playboy philosophy, that this wasn't sophistication, it was commercialized loneliness. It showed the women not as glamour pusses, but as low-wage workers in a dead-end job. It was a victory, a brief victory. Because almost immediately after the article was published, Gloria faced a devastating reality. The article backfired on her professionally disastrously. Instead of being hailed as a brave investigative journalist, she was now permanently typecast. She had broken the rules. Serious journalists didn't do stunts like this. And worse, she was now associated with the very thing she was trying to critique. She became the Playboy bunny. For years afterward, she couldn't get a serious assignment. Male editors now saw her as a joke, an attention seeker. They'd look at her in meetings and wink, "Oh, you're the bunny." She had learned a bitter lesson. You cannot change a system from within that doesn't respect you. You cannot use your body as a weapon without being defined by it. She was trapped again, but this time in an even more ridiculous cage, one made of satin and bunny ears. For the rest of the 1960s, she remained a journalist, but she was stuck. She was a freelancer, living hand to mouth. She wrote scripts for a political satire TV show called That Was the Week That Was. She wrote essays for Vogue and Glamour. She even wrote a column for New York Magazine about George McGovern's presidential campaign. She was working, she was surviving, but she was still an outsider looking in. She was a political commentator, but she didn't have a movement. She was a cultural critic, but she didn't have a platform. She was single. She was independent. She had avoided her mother's fate. But she was also lonely in her 30s in a world that still believed an unmarried woman her age was a tragedy. She had watched the rise of the civil rights movement. She had watched the anti-war movement. She was sympathetic, but she still felt something was missing. Something was still unsaid. And then, in 1969, a simple assignment changed everything. An editor at New York Magazine assigned her a story. He considered it another girl assignment, a piece of fluff. A radical group of women was holding an illegal speak-out meeting in Greenwich Village. They were going to talk about a forbidden subject, abortion. The editor thought it would be weird, maybe a funny story about kooks. He sent Gloria to cover it. Gloria, now 35, walked into the basement of a church on Washington Square. The room was packed with women. The air was thick. She arrived as a journalist, an objective observer, still skeptical of the loud feminist movement she'd been reading about. She sat down, took out her notebook, and prepared to document the freak show. The meeting began, and one by one, ordinary women, students, housewives, artists, stood up and did something they had never done before. They told their secrets. They told of back-alley abortions, of the fear, of the shame, of coat hangers, of dirty doctors, of almost dying. They told their stories, and they wept. Gloria Steinem sat there, and her pen stopped moving. She was no longer a journalist observing a story. She was one of them. She was listening to her own life being told, because Gloria had a secret too, a secret she had buried for 12 years. In 1957, when she was 22, just before she left for India, she'd gotten pregnant. She had been briefly engaged to a man in London, but she knew she couldn't marry him. She knew she couldn't have the baby. A baby then would have been the end of everything, the end of the fellowship, the end of her independence, the end of her hopes of escaping her mother's fate. She was desperate. And she had found a doctor in London willing to perform a dangerous, illegal abortion. The doctor had agreed, but on two conditions that had haunted her for a decade. First, she had to promise She would never, ever reveal his name. Second, he made her promise, "You must do what you want with your life." She had promised. The procedure was done. She went to India, and she never spoke of it again. For 12 years, she had carried that secret as a personal wound, a personal failure, a moment of shame and fear. Now, in this church basement, she was listening to dozens of women tell her exact story, her shame, her fear. And suddenly, it happened. The click moment that millions of women would come to experience. The moment all the disparate pieces of her life, her mother, Toledo, dependency, India, the cages, the girl jobs, the Playboy bunny, and now this secret, all of it snapped into place. This was not a personal problem. This was a political problem. Her shame was not her own. It was a weapon used by society to keep women silent and isolated. Her fear was not a personal failure. It was a public policy. Gloria Steinem walked into that church basement as a journalist looking for a story. She walked out as a revolutionary who had found her voice. She went home and wrote the article, but it was not the article her editor had expected. It was not funny. It was not kooky. It was called After Black Power, Women's Liberation. It was a manifesto. It was a call to arms. She connected all the dots, the caste system in India, the civil rights movement in America, and her mother's life in Toledo. She argued that the next and greatest revolution was already here. The article caused a shockwave, and for Gloria there was no turning back. She had found it. She had found her revolution. She started speaking out. This was terrifying. She was pathologically afraid of public speaking. She was not a natural orator. She would shake, throw up before going on stage. She spoke in a small, almost hesitant voice, but she did it, and she did it differently. She didn't yell. She didn't lecture. She did exactly what she had learned in India. She told stories. She listened. She turned every speech into a conversation, a mass consciousness-raising session. And she did something else strategic. Deeply aware of her position as a pretty white, Smith-educated woman, she knew she couldn't do this alone. She knew that if this movement was only for white, middle-class women, it would fail. So she sought out allies. She partnered with the greatest, most radical women of color of the era. She teamed up with Dorothy Pittman Hughes, a civil rights activist and community child care organizer in Harlem. They became an inseparable pair, a powerful visual of interracial solidarity. They would travel the country speaking together. They were an odd couple, Gloria, tall, slim, and white, and Dorothy, a powerful, vibrant black woman. Their iconic photo, both of them raising their fists in solidarity, became one of the defining images of the movement. She also partnered with Florence "Flo" Kennedy, a sharp, hilarious, take-no-prisoners African-American lawyer. Flo was older, tougher, and a firebrand orator. She was Gloria's mentor and her bodyguard. Flo used to introduce them by saying, "I'm the old black mare, and I'm bringing this pretty white filly along to show you all that we're not man-haters and we're not all lesbians." Together they shattered every stereotype. They were smart, they were funny, and they were drawing crowds. But Gloria quickly realized a problem, the same problem she'd had as a journalist. The media still didn't get it. The male reporters covering their events would invariably focus on Gloria. They'd call her the pretty face of the movement. They'd ask her insulting questions about her love life. They would ignore the women of color standing right next to her. They were still trying to turn her revolution into a girl story. And the existing women's magazines, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Ladies' Home Journal, wouldn't touch these stories. They were too busy teaching women how to please their husbands and bake a perfect cake. Gloria realized she was trying to pour a revolutionary message into old bottles. It wasn't working. She didn't need another article. She needed a new magazine. A magazine owned by women, run by women, and telling the truth about women's lives. Not about how to get a man, but about how to be a person. It was a crazy idea, an impossible idea. The male publishers they pitched to laughed in their faces. Cute, they said. But nobody wants to read this. Women aren't interested in politics. They're interested in fashion and men. Even Truman Capote, if asked, probably would have agreed they were wrong. And Gloria Steinem, along with a small, brilliant, and equally frustrated group of female journalists, including Pat Carbine and Letty Cotton Pogrebin, decided to prove just how wrong they were. They knew they couldn't get millions in venture capital from the male-dominated financial world. They needed a proof of concept. They needed to show, not tell, that an audience for these ideas existed. Gloria had an in that the others didn't. She was a contributing editor at New York Magazine, a publication run by the maverick editor Clay Felker. She went to him with a proposal, not for a whole new company, but for a single trial run issue. They would create a 30-page preview, a one-shot special, and insert it into the end-of-year issue of New York in December 1971. Felker, a risk-taker who sensed the cultural winds shifting, agreed. The group set to work, often in Gloria's apartment, spreading out pages on the floor. The first fight was over the name. What should they call it? They cycled through dozens of ideas, but none felt right. They wanted something that captured the sea change they were feeling. Then they remembered a small underground suggestion that had been circulating in activist newsletters. The word Ms. It was a linguistic masterstroke, a simple two-letter word that was an entire political statement. It was the female equivalent of Mr. It did not define a woman by her marital status, by her relationship to a man. A woman was not Miss or Mrs. She was simply Ms., a person in her own right. This was a direct linguistic assault on the world of Truman Capote. In his world, women were their husbands. They were Mrs. Bill Paley or Mrs. Gianni Agnelli. Their very identity was a title of ownership. Ms. was a declaration of independence. It was so radical, so unheard of, that the New York Times style guide refused to use it for decades. It was perfect. So in December 1971, the preview issue hit the stands. The cover itself was a jolt. It wasn't a smiling model. It was a bright, bold, illustrated poster look with a simple, defiant title, MS Magazine. Inside, the articles were unlike anything women had ever seen in a mainstream publication. There was The Housewife's Moment of Truth by Jane O'Reilly, a foundational essay that gave a name to that click moment of feminist awakening. There was an article by Gloria herself's Sisterhood explaining the political power of female friendship. It featured pieces on equal pay, on child care, and on how to raise children without gender stereotypes. The male publishers at New York Magazine were nervous. They had printed 300,000 copies of the preview, assuming it would be a niche, cult hit at best, and a financial flop at worst. They predicted it would sit on the shelves for weeks. The entire run sold out nationally in 8 days. It was a phenomenon. The dam had broken. In the following weeks, the Ms. office, which was essentially a few desks in a rented room, was flooded with over 20,000 letters. These weren't just subscription requests, they were confessions. They were cries of recognition. They were pages and pages from women all over the country saying, "I thought I was the only one. I thought I was crazy. You are writing my life." The impossible idea was now an undeniable fact. The audience was not only there, it was starving. With this proof, Gloria and Pat Carbine, who became the publisher, were able to raise the money to launch Ms. as a proper, independent monthly magazine, the first official issue, debuted in January 1972. The cover was another cultural bomb. It showed a modern update of the Hindu goddess Kali, an 8-armed woman juggling a frying pan, a steering wheel, a telephone, a typewriter, a mirror, a clock, an iron, and a baby. Underneath, a single devastating headline: the new magazine for women that can open your mind and change your life. It perfectly captured the exhausting, impossible balancing act that modern women were expected to perform. It wasn't an aspirational image like a Vogue cover. It wasn't telling you how to be perfect. It was a mirror reflecting women's own chaotic, overburdened reality right back at them. And this is where the war of words with the Capote worldview truly began. Capote's world, the world of the swans, ran on secrecy, shame, and whispers. It was a world of private tragedies, of problems that were never spoken of smiling through the pain. Ms. Magazine was the exact opposite. Its entire purpose was to take those private, shameful secrets and make them public, to make them political. Gloria and the editors of Ms. understood something profound. A secret's power is in its isolation. The moment you share it, the moment you realize 1,000 other people have the exact same secret, the shame evaporates. It is no longer a personal failure. It is a collective, political fact. The single greatest example of this was an article that ran in that very first 1972 issue. We have had abortions. This was more than an article. It was a petition, Gloria, remembering that click moment in the church basement, had conceived an idea. She knew the secret that had haunted her for 12 years was a shared one. So she, along with 52 other prominent American women, writers, artists, musicians like Billie Jean King and Nora Ephron, publicly signed their names to a statement declaring that they had in fact undergone illegal abortions. We must pause to understand how seismic this was. This was 1972, a year before the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision. Abortion was a crime. These women were publicly confessing to a felony. They were risking their careers, their reputations, and their freedom. Truman Capote would have seen a secret like this as the ultimate piece of gossip, a tragic, dirty secret to be whispered about at a dinner party. Gloria Steinem saw it as a political weapon. By signing their names, she and these women were de-weaponizing shame. They were saying, this is not a dirty secret. This is a medical procedure. This is a fact of our lives. We are not criminals. We are your sisters, your mothers, your colleagues, and we are not alone, and we will not be ashamed. This set the template for everything Ms. would do. It became a click delivery system, month after month. It took the darkest, most hidden parts of women's lives and dragged them into the light. It was the first mainstream magazine to put a battered woman on its cover, forcing a conversation about an issue that was always dismissed as a private family matter. It was the first to name and define sexual harassment in the workplace, which until then was just considered boys being boys or the price you pay for having a job. It wrote about date rape, about incest, about female genital mutilation, about the politics of housework. These were not just stories. This was language creation. This was worldview creation. Ms. was giving names to invisible forces, and in doing so, it was giving women the tools to fight them. The Ms. office itself was a reflection of this. It was not the silent, rarefied, hierarchical world of Vogue or The New Yorker. It was a chaotic, loud, underfunded, and often argued in collective decisions were made, often agonizingly, as a group. The pay scale was more equal. It was a living experiment in the very politics it was preaching, which was often messy but always authentic. It was a movement, not just a business, and it was working. The magazine was a commercial and cultural success. Gloria Steinem, as its founder and most recognizable face, was launched into a new level of superstardom. She was no longer just a journalist. She was the reluctant, beautiful, articulate face of a global revolution. This, of course, did not come without a price. The world that Truman Capote had so loved, the world of the old male-dominated establishment, did not take this lying down, and they were not the only ones. The backlash was coming, and it was coming from all sides. It was coming from the right, which saw her as a threat to the American family. And perhaps more painfully, it was coming from within the feminist movement itself. The success of Ms. Magazine was a declaration of war, and Gloria Steinem, whether she wanted to or not, had just become the general of a revolutionary army. The magazine was a validation, a source of power, and a beacon, but it also painted a massive target on her back. The backlash, when it came, was not a single wave, but a multi-front assault. It came from the establishment she was trying to topple, but also, and far more painfully, it came from the very movement she was trying to lead. The most visible and organized enemy was the political right. As the feminist movement, unified by Ms., turned its collective energy toward its most significant legal goal, the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the old world struck back. The ERA was a simple proposed amendment to the Constitution stating that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It seemed straightforward, a logical conclusion to the nation's founding principles. It passed Congress with bipartisan support in 1972 and was sent to the states for ratification, and then it ran into a brick wall named Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly was, in many ways, the perfect foil for Gloria Steinem. She was the anti-Gloria. If Steinem was the new, independent, single, career-driven woman, Schlafly was the avatar of the invisible cage, the suburban housewife, but with a crucial difference. Schlafly was a brilliant, highly educated, and politically savvy powerhouse. She held a master's degree, would later earn a law degree, had run for Congress, and was a published author on nuclear strategy. She was a professional woman in every sense of the word, but she was using her formidable intellect and energy to champion the role of the traditional stay-at-home wife. Schlafly saw the ERA and Steinem's liberation movement as a direct mortal threat to the women she represented. She launched the Stop ERA campaign, and she did it with a genius that feminists fatally underestimated. While Steinem was holding consciousness-raising circles in New York, Schlafly was mobilizing an army of housewives by appealing to their deepest fears, and she did it by framing the entire debate. Steinem and the Ms. Feminists were arguing for abstract rights, equality, opportunity, and non-discrimination. Schlafly, in contrast, argued with terrifyingly specific, emotional, and concrete boogeymen. She argued that the ERA would mean women would be drafted into military combat. She claimed it would eliminate all female colleges. She warned it would lead to unisex bathrooms, a truly shocking and visceral threat to the sensibilities of 1970s Middle America. But her most brilliant and insidious argument was a psychological one. She told the women of the invisible cage that their lives mattered. She argued that feminists like Gloria Steinem, these elite, single, childless careerists, looked down on them. She claimed the libbers saw housewives as pathetic, unfulfilled doormats. Schlafly's message was, "They despise you, but I honor you." She framed being a housewife not as a cage, but as a privileged, protected status. This was the war for the soul of the American woman. Steinem was trying to liberate the women in the invisible cage, but Schlafly had convinced them that the cage was, in fact, a pedestal Schlafly's homemade bread and apple pie brigades, who would show up at state legislatures to lobby against the ERA, were a perfect piece of political theater they were fighting, in essence, for their right to remain dependent, a status they had been taught to see as a privilege. The battle between Steinem and Schlafly was a brutal public war, and Schlafly's tactical genius, combined with the deep-seated fears of a changing nation, ultimately stalled the ERA just 3 states short of ratification. It was a devastating loss for the movement and a powerful demonstration of the backlash, but the attacks from the right were predictable. They were the old world fighting for its life. Far more wounding and far more complex were the attacks coming from within the movement itself. The feminist revolution was never a single, unified entity. It was, from the beginning, a fractured and contentious coalition of different ideologies. And Gloria Steinem, with her beauty, her media savvy, and her new glossy magazine, was standing directly on the fault line. The movement was broadly split into 2 camps. On one side were the liberal feminists. This was Steinem. This was Betty Friedan. This was the National Organization for Women. Their goal was reform. They wanted to work within the existing system to change the laws. They wanted equal pay, an end to discrimination, reproductive rights, and a seat at the table. They wanted, in essence, an equal piece of the American pie. On the other side were the radical feminists, groups like the Red Stockings or the Furies. They didn't want a piece of the pie. They wanted to blow up the entire bakery. They argued that the entire system, capitalism, the nuclear family, the church, and even heterosexual relationships, was the source of oppression. They believed liberal reform was just a way to make the cage more comfortable. They didn't want to join the system. They wanted to build a new world from scratch. To these radical feminists, Ms. Magazine was not a revolutionary tool. It was a betrayal. It was a slick, capitalist, New York-based, advertising-driven product. They saw its glossy pages and its reliance on ads as proof that it was just selling a light version of feminism, one that was safe for the establishment. And the face of this sellout was Gloria Steinem. This is where the second front of the war against her began. The attacks from her sisters were deeply personal, and they all centered on the one thing that made her so effective: her image, Betty Friedan, the intellectual mother of the movement, who had penned its founding text, The Feminine Mystique, had grown to despise Steinem. Friedan was a brilliant, abrasive, and often difficult academic. She had done the intellectual heavy lifting, and she watched with burning jealousy as the entire movement and all the media attention flocked to this pretty face, who had never written a foundational book. Friedan felt eclipsed, and she lashed out. Friedan publicly and privately attacked Steinem, accusing her of being all style and no substance. She famously or infamously mocked Steinem, saying, "The media created Gloria. She is not the movement." At one public event, Friedan reportedly screamed at Steinem, "This is all your fault. The movement is being ruined by your celebrity." This was more than an ideological disagreement. It was raw human envy. Friedan believed the movement should be led by its thinkers, but the media and the public were hopelessly drawn to its star. This resentment was not limited to Friedan. The radical wing of the movement also distrusted Steinem's celebrity. They had a name for it: celebrity feminism. They accused her of using the movement to build her own personal brand. This was the central painful contradiction of Gloria's life. The very same anti-swan quality that made her a unique and effective weapon was the exact thing her allies used to attack her. Her beauty, her style, her ease with the media, all the things that Capote's swans had, but which Gloria was trying to use for revolution, made her inauthentic in the eyes of the radicals. They mistrusted her because she was not angry enough, not unattractive enough, not fringe enough to be one of them. She was, in their eyes, too appealing to the mainstream, which meant she must be a sellout. This all coalesced around the single most dangerous and devastating accusation ever leveled at Gloria Steinem. It was a conspiracy theory, a poison-tipped arrow aimed directly at the heart of her credibility, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The accusation was that Gloria Steinem was not a feminist. She was a CIA agent. To understand this, we must go back just as her critics did, to the late 1950s. Remember that 22-year-old Gloria, fresh from Smith, who went to India? When she returned, she was a passionate liberal anti-communist. The Cold War was at its absolute peak. The world was starkly divided between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In 1959, Gloria became involved in organizing American student participation in the World Youth Festivals, which were then major Soviet-funded anti-American propaganda events. Steinem's goal, and the goal of the organization she co-founded, was to provide a non-communist liberal alternative for students at these festivals. She was, in her mind, fighting for the third way, for democratic values against both Soviet totalitarianism and American McCarthyism. What she was not fully aware of, or at least not in full, was where the money was coming from. The organization she directed, the Independent Research Service, was receiving its funding secretly from the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA, in its cultural Cold War, was covertly funding all sorts of liberal groups, artists, writers, and student organizations, to act as a counterweight to Soviet influence. Gloria worked for this organization for several years, then left in the early 1960s to pursue her journalism career long before her click moment and her involvement in feminism. The story of the CIA's funding of these groups was eventually broken in the press in 1967, to her genuine surprise. She moved on. The story died until the mid-1970s. As the feminist movement fractured, the radical group Red Stockings, who were deeply suspicious of Ms. Magazine's liberal agenda, started digging. They were looking for an explanation. Why was the movement, which they felt should be a radical, anti-capitalist, lesbian separatist revolution, being taken over by this media-friendly, reformist, straight, feminist icon? They found the old CIA story, and to them it was the smoking gun. They published a scathing article and held a press conference. Their accusation was explosive. Gloria Steinem was a government plant, a Manchurian candidate for feminism. They argued her entire career was a CIA operation, a psyop designed to infiltrate the real feminist movement and steer it away from its radical, anti-capitalist roots. They claimed her role was to make the revolution safe for the establishment, to turn it into a harmless, liberal, bourgeois movement that just wanted equal pay instead of the overthrow of the patriarchy. Ms. Magazine, in their eyes, was her primary tool of co-optation. This was a devastating checkmate-level accusation. It was designed to destroy her utterly. It painted her every success, her media savvy, her ability to build coalitions, the popularity of Ms., not as achievements, but as proof of her treachery. Gloria was forced to defend herself. She explained the timeline patiently, over and over. This was in the 1950s. She was a 22-year-old idealist. It was a full decade before the feminist movement as we know it even began. She explained that she was not fully aware of the full source of the funds and that her motives were always about promoting liberal democratic ideals. But her most powerful defense was a simple, logical one. The idea that the CIA, a deeply patriarchal, conservative old boys club, would have the foresight or the desire to invent the women's liberation movement was, as she put it, a fantasy. The CIA didn't create feminism. They were, like every other male-dominated institution, terrified of it. But in the paranoid post-Watergate atmosphere of the 1970s, the mud stuck. The CIA rumor would follow her forever, whispered in radical circles, a permanent asterisk next to her name. This was the unbearable trap the old world right used her beauty to dismiss her as a frivolous pinup. Simultaneously, the New World radical left used her beauty to condemn her as a bourgeois sellout to the right. She was a threat. To the radical left, she was a traitor. Gloria stood alone between two fires. Simultaneously, the New World radical left wing used her beauty and style to condemn her. They painted her as a celebrity, a bourgeois sellout, a CIA-funded media darling who was too pretty to be an authentic revolutionary. She was too radical for the establishment and too polished for the radicals, a woman no side could claim entirely as their own. This was her personal, emotional battle. She wasn't just fighting a war against the system. She was fighting a civil war within her own movement and a profound psychological war against her own image. While Capote's swans were destroyed by their dependency on men and social approval, Gloria was being attacked for her independence, an independence so total, so threatening, that many of her own sisters couldn't believe it was real. They had to invent a conspiracy to explain her, because the simple truth that she was just a smart, strategic, and effective organizer was somehow harder to believe. Gloria Steinem was now trapped in the crossfire, a general under siege from both her declared enemies and her supposed allies. The political right, under Phyllis Schlafly, was painting her as a home-wrecking monster, a threat to the very fabric of the American family. Simultaneously, the radical left, driven by figures like Betty Friedan and factions like the Red Stockings, was painting her as a CIA-funded sellout, a pretty-faced, establishment-friendly traitor to the real revolution. She was too radical for the mainstream and too mainstream for the radicals. This was an impossible, psychologically brutal position to be in. How does one respond to such a two-front war? A different person might have broken or retreated or lashed out. But Gloria Steinem's response was not one of emotion. It was one of pure, calculated strategy. She had learned from her childhood, from her time in India, and from her bunny expose that the world would always try to define her by her appearance. Her image was the weapon they all tried to use against her. So she decided to neutralize that weapon completely. She invented a uniform. This is the key to understanding her anti-swan brilliance. The swans of Truman Capote's world, like Babe Paley, were defined by their fashion. Their job was to be chameleons of style, to be trendsetters, to be walking passive objects of art. Their appearance was their entire currency. Gloria's strategy was the exact opposite. She deliberately refused to be fashionable. She created a look that was, in essence, an anti-look. She settled on a uniform, the simple black turtleneck or t-shirt, the bell-bottom jeans, the concho belt, and most famously, the oversized blue-tinted aviator glasses. This uniform was a work of genius. It was not style, it was armor. By wearing the same essential outfit day after day, year after year, she made her appearance boring. She made it a non-topic. She forced the cameras and the critics to move past what she was wearing and finally, reluctantly, have to listen to what she was saying. While Capote's swans were terrified of being photographed in the same dress twice, Gloria made a political statement by wearing the same look for 2 decades. The glasses were a particularly crucial part of this. They were a shield, a barrier. They created a small private space between Gloria the icon and Gloria the person, who was still deep down a shy writer who was terrified of public speaking. The swans were desperate to be seen. Gloria was fighting to be heard. This strategy extended to her voice. As the 1970s raged with the loud, abrasive, yippie style of protest, the screaming of Abby Hoffman, the confrontational theater of the radicals, Gloria cultivated a different kind of power. She never raised her voice. Her speaking style was calm, rational, almost therapeutic. She would stand before a hostile crowd or a patronizing male talk show host, and she would simply talk, connecting her political points back to personal human stories. This maddened her radical allies, who mistook her calmness for weakness. They wanted a firebrand. She was giving them a professor. But Gloria understood her audience. She knew that the screaming, angry feminists, while necessary, were also scaring away the exact people she needed to reach, the millions of women in the invisible cages of the suburbs. Her quiet, non-threatening, logical style was a key. It was a Trojan horse. It allowed her to walk into the living rooms of mainstream America, past their defenses, and deliver a message so revolutionary it would have been rejected if it had been shouted. This combination, the neutralizing uniform, the disarming voice, made her an almost untouchable figure. But the personal cost of becoming this icon was immense. While Capote's swans were exhausted by the demands of the social season, Gloria was exhausted by the demands of a revolution. Her life was not, as her critics imagined, a glamorous whirlwind of New York parties. Her life was a brutal, relentless grind. She spent the 1970s and 1980s living out of a suitcase, flying coach, crisscrossing the country to speak in small college gymnasiums, church basements, and community centers. She was in a different city almost every night, sleeping in cheap motel rooms, eating bad food, and perpetually, agonizingly jet-lagged. She was an itinerant organizer, a traveling saleswoman for an idea. This lifestyle created a profound loneliness. She had friends, she had lovers, but she had no home. She had no private life. She had sacrificed the very things her mother had been defined by: marriage, children, a stable home, to the movement. She was in many ways the living embodiment of her famous quote, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." She had proven she didn't need a man. She had proven she could be a complete, self-sufficient, powerful entity on her own. She had, in fact, avoided marriage with an almost religious fervor. It was the one cage she would never, ever enter. She had seen it destroy her mother, and she had built her entire life on the vow that it would not destroy her. And then in her 60s, she did the last thing anyone, including herself, ever expected. She fell in love. His name was David Bale. He was a South African-born entrepreneur, an environmentalist, an animal rights activist, and he was in every way her equal. He was not intimidated by her. He was not looking for a swan to put on a pedestal. He was a fellow activist who saw her, understood her, and adored her. They met, and for the first time in her life, the old primal fear of marriage, the fear of erasure, the fear of her mother's fate, was eclipsed by the simple human desire for partnership. But it was a profound psychological crisis. To marry now, after decades of being the public icon of female independence, felt like a betrayal. What would her critics say? What would her allies say? But more importantly, what would it mean for her? She wrestled with it, and she realized a profound truth. The reason she could even consider marriage now was because of the very revolution she had helped to lead. The world in 2000 was not the world of 1950 marriage, for a woman like her was no longer a legal or economic prison. She was not Babe Paley, dependent on her husband's name. She was Gloria Steinem, She had her own money, her own career, her own identity. She wouldn't be Mrs. David Bale. They would be two equal partners. She could finally marry because she no longer needed to. She had, in essence, fought to create a world where a woman like her could get married safely. So in 2000, at the age of 66, Gloria Steinem got married. It was a quiet ceremony, and the world was stunned but also charmed. She had found a personal peace, a partnership that complemented rather than contradicted her life's work. It was a beautiful, unexpected, and deeply human third act. And then, just as quickly, it turned into a tragedy. Only 3 years after their wedding, David Bale was diagnosed with brain lymphoma, a rare and aggressive cancer. He died just 9 months later. Gloria, the woman who had spent her life as a pillar of strength for a global movement, was now a widow, left to grieve the man she had finally allowed herself to love. The partnership she had waited her entire life to finally feel safe enough to build, this then is the fragile human core of the icon. And the contrast to Truman Capote could not be more stark or more devastating. While Gloria Steinem was spending the 1970s and early 80s building a global movement, fighting a two-front war, and creating a new language of power, Truman Capote was in a spiral of self-destruction. The very year Ms. Magazine was at its peak, 1975, was the year Capote published La Côte Basque and committed social suicide. As Gloria was being attacked by the left and right, she was responding with strategy and resilience. As Capote was attacked by his former swans, he responded with paranoia, alcohol, and cocaine. While Gloria was on a plane every night, working, building, and organizing, Capote was at Studio 54, clinging to the remnants of a celebrity that was rapidly becoming pathetic. While Gloria was finding her true, calm, powerful voice, Capote's was being slurred by drugs. And most tellingly, while Gloria, at 66, was finally vulnerable enough to find true love, Capote had died alone, an outcast at age 59, destroyed by his lifelong, desperate, and unfulfilled need to be loved by the very swans he had betrayed. One of them had built a life of substance, the other a life of style. And in the end, the woman who had rejected the gilded cage had found a human connection, however brief, that the man who worshipped the cage could only dream of this stark, brutal contrast in the fates of Gloria Steinem and Truman Capote is the final definitive answer to our central question. It is the very heart of the historical argument Capote, the supposed master narrator of the female experience, ended as a tragic, lonely figure destroyed by the very world of secrets, shame, and social dependency that he had both chronicled and exploited. His legacy, while brilliant, is purely literary. It's a perfectly preserved, tragic diorama of a dead world. The swans he immortalized are just that, frozen in time, their gilded cages, now a museum, exhibit his use of women's stories was an act of betrayal, and it led to his own isolation and death. Gloria Steinem's legacy, on the other hand, is not a diorama. It is the architecture of the world we now inhabit. Her use of women's stories was not an act of betrayal, but an act of mass liberation. Where Capote's gossip led to shame and isolation, Steinem's consciousness-raising led to solidarity and power. This is the war of words that she won, and that he could never have understood. He was an observer of the cage. She was the architect of the escape route. The implications of her work are not something we study in a museum. They are the rights, the language, and the assumptions that define our modern lives. Every time a woman in the 21st century gets a credit card in her own name, or signs a lease for an apartment without a male cosigner, or applies for a job that isn't segregated by gender. She is walking on a path that Gloria Steinem helped to clear. Every time a political debate rages about reproductive rights, it uses the language that Ms. Magazine fought to bring out of the back alleys and into the light. The very terms sexual harassment and domestic violence, which were once dismissed as private matters or just life, were dragged onto the public stage by her and her colleagues, where they could be seen, named, and finally legislated against. The most profound living legacy of her work is the direct line from the consciousness-raising circles of the 1970s to the hashtag #MeToo movement of the 21st century. The fundamental technology is the same. It is the act of transforming a private, secret shame into a public, political fact. The We Have Had Abortions petition, which seemed so radical in 1972, was the direct ancestor of the online testimonial, the crowdsourced chorus of Me Too. It is the same principle. Shame cannot survive solidarity. Gloria's life work was the analog, grassroots version of the digital revolution that would come decades later. She proved the model. Unlike Capote, who became a ghost of a bygone era, Steinem's significance only grew as she aged. She did not rest. She did not retire. After the tragedy of David Bale's death, she did not retreat into the silence of her swan counterparts. She doubled down. She became the elder stateswoman of the movement she had helped to birth. She embraced the role, not as a celebrity, but as a perpetual organizer. She became a mentor to a new generation of activists, tirelessly passing the torch. In her 70s, 80s, and even into her 90s, she was still on the road, still on a plane, still sitting in circles and listening to stories. She became a living link, a bridge from the second wave of feminism to the fourth, ensuring the lessons learned were not forgotten. This is the ultimate historical significance of her life. Truman Capote wrote the beautiful, witty, and tragic obituary for the old world. Gloria Steinem wrote the messy, difficult, and powerful blueprint for the new one. The world of the swans was small, exclusive, and built on silence. The world that Gloria built was vast, inclusive, and defiantly, powerfully loud. So in the end, we are left with two legacies, two opposing narratives that define the transition from the 20th century to the 21st. We have the story of Truman Capote, and we have the story of Gloria Steinem. And the final verdict, the reason one life ended in tragedy and the other in triumph, all comes down to their fundamental relationship with the stories of women. Truman Capote was, by every definition, the ultimate insider. He was the pet, the jester, and the confessor of the gilded cage. He was emotionally parasitic, needing the approval and secrets of his swans to validate his own fragile sense of self, just as much as they needed their husband's wealth to validate theirs. He was, in his own way, as dependent as they were. His tragedy was not just that he betrayed his friends. It was that his entire identity was built on their validation. When he lost that validation, he had nothing left to live for. He was destroyed by his desperate need to be inside the party. Gloria Steinem's power came from the exact opposite source. She was and always remained the ultimate outsider. This status, which caused her so much personal and political pain, the sellout accusations, the CIA smears, the pretty girl dismissals, was in fact her most potent strategic weapon. She was never fighting to be accepted by the New York elite. She was never trying to be a swan. Her validation came not from the whispers of socialites, but from the shared truths of women in church basements, from the 20,000 letters that flooded the Ms. office, from the click moments of recognition that she sparked across the nation. Truman Capote was destroyed by a loss of social status. Gloria Steinem built her entire movement by rejecting social status as a worthwhile goal in the first place. You cannot mock a woman who does not care about your party. This is the final crucial lesson. In the end, this was never just a political battle for Gloria Steinem. It was a deeply personal one. Capote, the boy from the troubled South, spent his entire life running toward the gilded cage, desperate to be let in. He saw the swans and wanted to be their pet, to be surrounded by their tragic glamour. Gloria, the girl from Toledo, spent her entire life running away from the ghost of her mother's cage. She saw what dependency, isolation, and a wasted intellect had done to Ruth Steinem, and she swore she would build a world where that could never happen again. His life was a quest for glamour. Her life was a quest for self-possession. That is why she won. That is why she and not he is the one who changed our world. Capote's world was finite. It was a dinner party, and when the guests went home, it was over. Steinem's world is a revolution, and it continues long after its founders are gone. In the end, the distinction is simple. Truman Capote's great literary talent was dedicated to documenting the heartbreaking, beautiful, and static tragedy of the cage, while Gloria Steinem's entire life was dedicated to the messy, difficult, and practical work of distributing the blueprints for the key. He was the masterful storyteller of the women who were trapped. She was the woman who gave them the language, the tools, and the solidarity to set themselves free.